In this video, I'm going to show you again how scope is able to follow a function around after it's been created, even if we pass that function on as a parameter to other functions or assign it to different variables. And so scope follows our functions around. And I'm going to show you in this video a pattern where this can be useful. So I've created a function here called createWorker. And as we've seen before, anytime this function gets called, a new scope will get created. And that scope will follow around any functions that are created inside of this function. So for example, let's go over inside and create a new function inside of here. I could do that just by creating a new variable like this. Or I could even return a function. Anytime I use the function keyword or create a new function inside of this createWorker body, that function will carry around with it the scope that gets created by calling createWorker. So anytime I call createWorker, a new scope gets created, and that scope will follow around this function and this function. Now what I'd like to do is, instead of returning a function, I'm going to return an object. And so we'll call this object a worker, and we'll put a method or property on this object called doWork. And the property's value will be a function. So even though I'm creating a property value here, I am creating a new function, and that new function will go on the heap at the time that createWorker gets called. And so we'll create this function called doWork. And just to make sure that it's working, let's go ahead and write out to the console that we're working it when we call this doWork function. And then down here, what I'll do is create a worker variable, and in the console, we'll go ahead and call the doWork function. In the console debugger, I have the worker object now, and it has a property called doWork, and I can call that function like this, and it should print to the console, I'm working it. Now what we want to do is to make sure that when I call doWork, it only does the work once. And so what we're going to do is to turn this worker into something called an idempotent worker, and that means that it only does its job one time, even if we call the function multiple times. So I'm going to change this to create idempotent worker, just a little bit of vocab there, so I can demonstrate how this will work in JavaScript. So we're going to create an idempotent worker. And to do that, we're going to take advantage of the fact that we've created a new scope using this closure. So I'm going to create a private variable here called isDone or isWorked, and it'll start off as false. Then inside of the doWork function, I'll say if we've already done the work, we'll just print out a message that says that we already did it. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and print out the message that we're working it, and we'll change this variable to true so that next time this function is called, it prints out this message here. Now let's talk a little bit about why this works. First, in the console, I'll call the doWork method. And it says that I'm working it, and let's try it again. And this time it says that it already did it. And in fact, any time that I call this function anymore, it will say that it's already done the work. Now over in the watch expression area, I've created a new watch expression for this worker variable. And if you expand it, you can see the object that was returned from our create idempotent worker function here. And this object has a property called doWork, and its value is a function. And because that function was created in this scope, it has access to this private variable. So if I expand this doWork function here, notice the function scope as we've seen before. And the function scope has a closure. And that closure object has this isWorked property, and it's set to false right now. Now it should actually be set to true, so let me refresh this, and that's because we've already run it and reset the isWorked variable to true. So if I refresh this and jump into the scope again, you'll see that it's actually been reset to true. So this function here has access to this private variable through this closure or scope, and this will follow around this function anywhere that it goes for the rest of the time that it exists. Let me show you an example. I'm going to create a simple function called callback, and the only thing it's going to do is to take a function as an argument, or CB for short, callback, and it will just call that function right away. Then what I'll do down here is call that function, and I'll pass in the doWork function of our worker. So I'm passing in this function of the worker object to this callback function, which will just call this right away. So this is a pattern that we use all the time, where we take a function and we pass it in as an argument to another function. And what I want to show you here is how this doWork function maintains its scope even though I'm passing it along to another function. And in the console, you can see that it prints out that I'm working it. But let's copy and paste this line so that we call the callback, or we pass in this doWork function again to the callback method. And if I save this time around, you'll see the second time it says I already did it. And that's because the doWork function has its scope carried around with it wherever it goes. To show that to you, let me put a debugger inside of the doWork function. And when I save, the first time around I'll just press play. The second time around I'll pause, and let's take a look at the scope variables. There's nothing in local scope, but if we look inside of closure, we should see that the isWorked variable is true, and that's why when we step through here, it prints out that we already did the work. Let me make one last point. The closure is created every time we call this function, and so every time this function gets called and a new object like this gets returned, a new function gets created here and a new scope is created. And so, for example, if I said another worker is equal to create idempotent worker, and we call the callback again, this time around it's going to be a new scope object, not related to this one. Let me move this down here so that it's a little bit more clear. And now over in the console, it'll say I'm working it, I already did it, and it'll print that out twice, once for our first worker and then again for another worker. So what's happening here is every time we call this function, a new local scope is created right here. And so it's as if this variable is getting defined for each time this function is called. And then these functions that get created and returned down here have access to these scope instances. So the fact that we can create a state object like this that gets created when we call a function is unique to functional languages like JavaScript, and is pretty confusing if you're coming from other types of languages. So what I'd recommend is that you play around with this concept in the browser until your mind starts to get used to the fact that there's an object being created here where we can store variables or state for anything that's returned within the closure.